Okay, so we're now recording. I'd like to welcome you all to this e-memoir session. We're joined by Dr. Sally Wootton of FETN or FETN. And this afternoon we're looking at revisiting targeting setting, making it work for you and for your students. We'd like to keep the session as interactive as possible, so please feel free to use the question or chat facility. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sally. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Marek. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to just have a little look today about revisiting target setting. It's an issue that's been on my mind for quite some time, and quite often in Ofsted reports we get a lot about smart targets. They're not smart enough, they're not working well enough, they're not encouraging learners for stretch and challenge. So all of this got quite interesting when I started looking through the various Ofsted reports. So I've been giving it some thought. I'm just sharing my ideas today. So this is not you know, set in stone what you should be doing. It's about sharing what I think and hopefully hearing what you think, and together we might be able to resolve some of the issues that are currently around the subject. So I hope you join in. I'd like lots of questions. I'd like your thoughts and your comments. So please feel free to join in as and when, and off we go. So shall we start with the first slide, please, Marek? Thanks for that. Okay, so essentially what I'd like to just talk about today is looking at the problem of target setting, what we think those problems are, clarifying the purpose and process, because I think there's a lot of issues around what we're actually meant to be doing when we're target setting and what we're hoping the outcome to be. Revisiting the terminology, because I think that's got a little bit confused and people are referring to it in different ways, and that's creating some kind of tensions in terms of what we're meant to be doing. And then looking at how we can change that and embracing that change, and maybe freshening and livening this subject up a little bit. So that's what I've got planned for today, and as I say, please just you know, the comments and views as we go along, questions will be very welcome. Okay, next slide please. We've got a list here of the kinds of problems that I've seen as I've been visiting various colleges and discussing this with other people, were the kinds of problems that we seem to be facing. I'll just give you a moment to take a look at those, and it would be interesting to know whether or not you can recognise some of these issues for yourself. So as I say, these are the kinds of issues that I've been coming across across the sector. And I think one of the main things for me has been this systems driven process, where we've got a lot of colleges now have got wonderful systems, online software that they can use, but it's quite inflexible, and the language that's being used within those systems don't necessarily help us in developing this notion of target setting. We use unhelpful terminology, and I think also we can get trapped into demotivating targets, so we've either passed them or we've failed, and there's nothing there that recognises the efforts that are actually put into developing those targets and working towards those targets. So these are, as I say, some of the issues, and it will be interesting at some point to know whether or not you've faced any of these yourselves.
I'm just going to say to Sally before you move on, you know,
yes.
When you've got lack of buy-in, is that lack of buy-in from the students, and what about from the tutors as well? Have you ever come across that lack of buy-in from the lecturers and tutors themselves?
Most definitely, yes. And I think the problem is because it's become such a mechanistic system of we have to do these targets, and sometimes it's the college that says, well, these will be our targets across the college, and then we might have some departmental targets put in there. So by the time it comes down to the learning conversation with the learner, there's very little room to actually discuss what it is that the learner needs. And because it feels so mechanistic, the tutors don't feel like they've got any real input into that or any control over it. So yes, that's where that lack of buy-in often comes in. And of course, if the tutors are not buying into this system, then most certainly the students won't, because they won't see the value in it either.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you.
So promoting shared terminology, this is what I alluded to earlier when I was saying that the terminology is getting very confused now. And one of the main things that I do notice is that when I'm looking at target setting per se across a college, quite often on a timetable it will say target setting. Now target setting is actually, it's the final part of the whole learning conversation, or should be. It's the review, the one-to-one review itself, that learning conversation is the main activity of which target setting emerges from that conversation. I think also we have issues with aims, objectives and targets. We're actually quite often we're setting aims and objectives and we're not setting targets. So when it comes back to measuring, we're trying to measure something that's too big. So in essence, the aim is a statement of what someone wants to do or achieve. The objective is the specific task that contributes to achieving the aim. So there might be 2 or 3 of those for each individual statement of intent. And then the target is a number of targets, the small steps needed to fulfill a single objective. Now, I'm sorry you've not got that. Oh, there it is. So if you can just hopefully see that on the screen, you can see how these things work. So there you can see you have your overall aim, you can have a number of objectives to reach that aim, and then you have a number of targets underneath each objective. So quite often when we're writing targets, we're not specifically writing those targets into an ILP or into the online software mechanisms that you use. We're actually writing either aims or objectives, and that can be very confusing. And it can also be quite demotivating, because what you've got then is you've got big leaps that you're trying to achieve rather than those smaller steps. So this is just one example. I'll just give you a moment just to read through that and to picture that diagram as you're reading through. I feel like I'm rattling on quite a bit here. Are there any comments or questions at this point? Okay, I'm not hearing anything at the moment, so hopefully from this is an example of academic target setting. So you can see that you have a particular aim, then those objectives will feed into that aim, but in order to fulfill those objectives, there are a number of smaller steps which are the targets that we would do in order to fulfill the ultimate aim. Could we go on to the next slide, please, Marek? Thank you. So here we've got just another example, and this is target setting for a behavioural issue. One that crops up a lot, I think, punctuality and attendance. Give you a moment to read that. How are we doing?
Absolutely brilliantly, Sally. Sorry, I was just working away in the background. No, you're there. Don't worry. I was just making sure that everything was working fine in the background now. So we are here. Don't worry. No, absolutely fine. Keep the questions coming, please. Please keep the questions coming. All.
Have we got any questions at this point?
I've got a question for you, Sally, from one of the listeners.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is, it's, I think this is quite a good question. In terms of who's best to do this, this is a question about someone who works with study programs, you know, with 16 to 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
And they say, who's the best person to be doing these two different types of target setting, the academic and the behavioral? Is it the sort of personal tutor who also teaches them the academic subject, or is it better done by a progress coach that might not necessarily have or might not necessarily contribute to their... Any thoughts on that?
My initial thought whenever I'm asked this kind of question is the person that's skilled in the learning conversation. So it's whoever has been trained to have that learning conversation, because these targets should be arising from the learner. So in terms of setting academic targets, for example, it doesn't need to be an academic tutor that's setting those targets, because the targets essentially should be coming out of whatever it is that that learner is discussing at the time, any issues that they might be having with progress. And so it's around that conversation that they come up. So in terms of who it is, it's the person that's best equipped to have that conversation with the learner, to be able to help them to draw out what their targets should be.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Sally. So you're saying as long as they're skilled and trained, that's whoever's best to do it, as long as they've got the right skill set and the right background and training.
Yes, I mean, essentially I would say that this is a personal tutor stroke progress coach role, yeah. And the monitoring of progress is part of that role. But it might be that an academic member of staff also has a tutoring role within that, but it certainly sits within the one-to-one review process. So it's whoever would be undertaking that role.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on then to the next slide. I think the important thing to note out of all of this is that it's about action. So the targets have got to be motivating, and they've got to create action. They've got to mean something to the learner, which is why it's important that it comes out of that learning conversation and is not just something that's written and presented to them as this is what you need to do. They have to own it. They have to understand it. It has to mean something for them in order for it to sort of get them actively moving forward. I've talked a lot about learning conversation because this really is the heart of it. With a positive learning conversation, you can start to draw out these targets as you're discussing. So this is the process essentially that a one-to-one review would look like. So it's where am I now, where I want to be, and you can see how the aims, the options and the objectives and then the targets are feeding into all of this. You can see the stages of the process and how that works, and it's about that meaningful conversation and those strategic questions that then enable the tutor to help the learner to draw out what those targets need to be, what those next steps are. And then obviously, how would we measure it? How would we know that they've been successful? And how well those strategies have worked is on reflection. So that's the process as a whole. So it's not a matter of sitting down and saying, right, you know, well, welcome to this session. We've got some targets to set. And I've seen this happen. You've got these, which everybody has to do. What else would you like to do? It's a bit more scientific than that, and I think we need to start to acknowledge that if we're going to increase learner autonomy and we're going to get them to be responsible for their own learning, we have to engage them in this type of conversation so that we can help them to identify their aims, their objectives, and then to create their targets to help them to achieve those.
A couple of questions,
yes.
Sally. Yeah, I've got two questions here. One from Paul, which I think actually you've already covered, which was this making sure that we break things down into smaller steps.
Yes.
But the danger Paul's highlighted is lead to a more mechanistic, checklisty approach if you do break it down into smaller steps.
The small, yeah, I understand what you're saying about the smaller steps. They are for the learner to be able to break down the activities that they're undertaking. It's not as mechanistic as it sounds, because it's coming from the learner, so it's their thought process that we're capturing and saying, okay, so if this is what you're wanting to do, how do you think you can get there? What will that mean you need to do? What are you going to do first? If that doesn't work, what else might you do? And it's that exploration that helps those targets to emerge. So it's out of a conversation. So targets will look different for every individual.
Yeah, that's a good answer there. Thanks for that. But that then, he works predominantly with adults who have signed up for advanced learning loan funded programs at levels 3 to 6.
Right.
Do you think when it comes to, and as part of obviously the sign up there, they do goal and target setting, what do you think about these targets? Should they be related to getting through the qualification or gaining employment in that area, or both? How does that work?
It should be both, because the whole purpose of a review is to enable progress in learning and development, and it may well be that there's underpinning development that's required to help them in their learning. So it's taking that holistic view of what that individual needs to be able to do to move on to the next step, or to improve on some aspect of what they're currently doing.
That's great, thank you. Hopefully, Paula.
So within all of this, the learner has a specific role, and this again, it's about encouraging autonomy, independence and responsibility for learning. So I'll just give you a moment just to read round this. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're just capturing the kind of engagement that we need to be encouraging with our learners during this review process. And it's about questioning, asking them questions so that they're thinking it through and they're coming to their own reality, if you like, of what issues they might have, what things they need to do and how they might do it. And you can see in here how they're also looking at, they're exploring their strategies, and this is through your questioning as a tutor to encourage them to explore those potential strategies to achieve their aims, to take account of potential barriers, so what might stop you, what might help you moving forward, to plan the task, and this is when that target setting comes in. It's giving purpose to targets, isn't it? Saying what are the little tasks that you need to do, the steps that you need to take, and what those deadlines might be for that, how you would measure that achievement. So it's about that clever questioning so that you can encourage the learner to think the process through, because the best strategies for them are their strategies. If we start to impose how to do something, they may not work in the same way that you do. They most probably won't. So it's about encouraging them to think about how they work best, because that's part also of preparing them for the future.
And Emilu asks a question just pertinent to what you've just said. This drawing, from the student and from the learner, their specific targets and goals. But she says, in reality, I've only usually got 15 to 20 minutes with each individual student, and I've got other sections that I've got to cover. Feels a bit rushed.
Yes, yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, let's be fair about this. The amount of time often is just not enough to do what we need to do. Now, one of the main things that I encourage that very few people do is encouraging the learner to prepare prior to the meeting. So they would have there are various formats and things that I've developed. I can share some of this stuff with people if they're interested, but it's about getting the learner to prepare prior to, and you would prepare yourself so that when you're actually sat down, the finite amount of time that you've got is purposeful time, and you're not looking up attendance and it's taking 10 minutes out of your 15 minutes because the computers are slow. It's about having all that information there and encouraging the learner to take that responsibility by preparing for these one-to-one reviews.
And Paul and Pam asked a question here that actually relates to the learners. Pam works particularly with adult learners, and they had an Ofsted report which said they needed more personalised and more challenging targets for the more able adults. And Paul similarly says he works mostly with adults who are disadvantaged, particularly adults who have had very little previous success in education. So working at both ends, how do we work with those who need more challenging targets for the more able and those that are more supportive for those that are perhaps less confident?
And again, that I mean, the really good questions, it again comes out of that conversation. So part of that conversation was what do you think you need to do next? What might that look like? What would you be able to do towards that? And if you've got somebody who's very limited in their confidence or their ability at a particular moment in time, then you would encourage them to say, what can you manage at this moment in time? What would be realistic for you? What would you like to have a go at? So it's how you couch those questions. For somebody who's more able and you're wanting stretch and challenge, and you know, you would couch it around, okay, so this is what you said that you could do. Is there anything more than that that you'd like to do? You know, was there anything else that you'd like to have a go at that's related to this, to take it to the next level? So it's about the conversation. It all comes back to that skilled conversation.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Sally. Thank you.
So we talked about skills, and I think this is something that gets lost in amongst all this target setting. Because it's not just about, you know, sort of saying, right, we've got to get these people through these courses, and so let's set some targets, and they've got to attend, and they've got to be punctual, and they've got to pass their assessments. It's this whole process, if valued and used properly, is far more valuable than that. And if you just take a look, I'll just give you a moment to take a look. These are the kinds of skills that are being developed by the learner as they go through this learning conversation process that we previously looked at. Any questions or comments on this? All okay with that?
Got an additional question here, Sally.
Yeah.
Yeah, from one of our listeners who's saying, in this thing about working with perhaps the more confident, more able, you know, people that need a challenge, what happens if they're not really able to describe what they might do differently next time? What's the role here of the tutor?
The main role is in asking questions, and from what the conversation has been. So in terms of how somebody might approach something, for example, you might explore different ways that they could approach that task. It might be that they say that they've mentioned a couple of things that they'd like to do, but as you're listening to them, you think, well, they might also need to be able to develop this skill in order to do that. So you could use that as a prompt. Have you considered, or how might this fit in with what you're wanting to do? So you're building your stretch and challenge in that way. So it's very much about listening to the messages and the subliminal messages about what people are saying, because quite often they'll skirt over something that's really important. So it's about picking up on that and following that through with a question.
Yeah, and we've got a comment there from one listener saying, so sometimes we move from being a coach to a mentor and back again. Is that right?
Quite possibly, yes. Yes, I mean all these different names, coach, mentor, tutor, they all fit together. We're doing that same kind of role, but in the distinction that I think they're making between coach and mentor, most definitely you would be switching between the two, because it's about holistic development. So it's that skills development as well as their personal development, which is an excellent segue to the next slide. Fabulous. So somebody mentioned earlier on about personalized target setting. So within that conversation, these are some of the things that we may be encouraging the learners to talk about. I'll give you a moment just to take a little look at those. So you can see how, you know, those learners that are more vulnerable, they have opportunities within that conversation to talk about welfare and support needs. And it might be that some of their targets are actually based around accessing support that they need prior to being able to move on and develop any academic targets. So it is very much about a personalised approach, and that's what Ofsted are looking for, is that personalised approach, which makes the learning conversation far more central, which is why I'm so passionate about those skills being developed in tutors to be able to have that kind of conversation. Okay, so on to the next slide then. Mentioned right at the beginning that I'd like to take a little look at the terminology. We've got SMART targets, and if you just have a look at this this interesting slide, it keeps changing. If we just take a little look at this and the words around there, the SMART targets in red, and then there's some other words round there that I think we need to be building into the terminology for target setting. So this is the process that's outlined, and then when you see the red, we've got the specific, the realistic, achievable, and so on and so forth that we talk about in SMART targets. So if we just move on to the next slide, please.
And there's another question from Paul just before you move on, which I think relates to some of that, with conversation in a useful, meaningful way. He says obviously a form is there, but sometimes it doesn't have enough room and you don't have enough time to fill it.
Yeah.
Any other formats which is a useful way of recording conversation?
This is a really difficult one, because these kinds of things tend to be managed and organised by people that are not necessarily doing the role. So the system, when I was doing manual ILPs, I actually had 5 different ILPs for different levels of learners that would capture the kind of information. But I think the most important thing is to leave as much space for recording the outcome of the conversation and not to have too many restrictive boxes. So it's just more space, because all we're trying to do is capture it so that people can remember what was said, that there is some evidence that it's taken place, but that people can refer back to it again to say, how did we do? So I think the less complicated that form is, the better.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So in the previous slide, we just had those various words, the SMART targets, and they are here on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, these are kind of extended. And I'm still playing with this, so your feedback on this would be great. But it's just the notion that we need to be considering more in our target setting. Now, they don't necessarily have to be written and recorded as, you know, SMART tends to be, we need to write it as SMART. I think we need to take a look at this whole approach to recording targets, but also to consider, are they relevant to your aims and objectives, and why are they important? And the why are they important is really important in terms of motivating learners, because if it's important to them, they're more likely to do it. So they need to recognise that importance as part of that conversation. Reflective, to enhance learning from the process and development, and to develop autonomy. So it's not just a matter of saying, reflecting on whether we've achieved or not, which is what we tend to do. It's also about why did it work? Why didn't it work? What is that saying about our strategies, and how will that help me to move on in a more independent way in the future? It needs to be evaluative to help to develop those strategies, and meaningful in the context of their environment, you know, in terms of their work and their learning. And this was something I think somebody alluded to earlier, you know, where you might have adult learners who are returners, who are not confident in the learning, who might have had difficulties in the past in a learning environment. So what they can expect from themselves will differ to what somebody who's come through, you know, a really positive educational experience would, you know, they're very different. So it has to be meaningful for them and be doable in that context, and then motivating to create enthusiasm for taking the next step. So they have to go away saying, I can do this. You know, those small steps that I've said, those little targets, I can do those, and then that actually will motivate them to taking action, rather than just setting a target that says I must improve my attendance, which is often the case. Okay, shall we move on? Oh, so I've talked a lot about questioning. I'm just going to give you a moment to take a look at this, because questioning is key to getting the learner to think through this process that takes them towards setting their targets. So I'll just give you a minute. I believe you will be getting a copy of this, so you'll be able to reflect on these after this webinar as well.
There's one question, Sally, as we're just looking at that, which obviously relates to the previous slide, but I think it's good at this point.
Yeah.
So SMART was easy, and then smarter. Have you come across any other models of target setting other than SMART that you've seen being used quite extensively in your experience?
No, I haven't, and I think this is one of the reasons why I think it's time to have this conversation, because I think we need something new and fresh, and sadly I haven't seen any other. I've seen different approaches and models in the learning conversation, but in terms of target setting specifically, we've got stuck with SMART, and it's not meaning anything anymore. So I think it needs refreshing, and I think we need to ask the question, what do we really want these targets to do? You know, what is the purpose of them? So hopefully this is the beginning of moving that on and getting to a better model that people can be more engaged in.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay. So those are just some helpful questions, like I say. Shall we move on to the next one? Just look at the language that we use. And again, these are some very typical terms that we see in target setting. Improve, is a big one, but what does improvement look like? We get more, we get regular, aim to. Well, we can all aim to, but it's not measurable. And what does complete look like? So in terms of our target setting, we also need to think about the language that we're using so that we can reflect on it and people really understand what it is that they're trying to achieve. So if what we're saying is, when you attend more, you would be saying attend at least 3 times or 5 times, or hopefully you understand what I'm saying when it's just about making it clear and making that target very specific so that we can say that that target's been achieved, and then that gives a sense of motivation, you know, because the effort's been rewarded, and so we can build on that. So language is really important, so that people know exactly what it is that they're trying to do.
Question here for you, Sally, about how often have you seen learners presented with sort of like scaling, you know, on a scale of 0 to 10, how much do you attendance? Have you ever seen that being used as well?
I have seen scaling used, yes, and I have used it myself. It can be very useful in terms of getting learners starting points, understanding where they want to be. So what will it take to get you from a 3 to a 5? And that can be a good inroad into having that conversation. Okay. So shall we move on to the next slide? So this is, yes, after we've had our wonderful one-to-one review and we've had a really good conversation and we've set our targets and the learner knows exactly what they're going to go away and do, it quite often disappears into the ether until the next term. And this is, I think, where a lot of target setting falls down, because we're not keeping up the momentum. And all right, it might be that you only see learners once a term, but there has to be other mechanisms for keeping that conversation going and ensuring that, you know, they've not gone away, thought that they could do it in a particular way, they've come across a hurdle, don't know what to do about it, they haven't got a meeting for another 6 or 8 weeks, so the whole issue just falls to the floor. So how can we keep it going to keep them on track? And I think this is one of the things that we don't do particularly well. Don't know if people have got comments on that one.
Yeah, there's a comment here about using things like mobile technology. Have you found that in your experience, again, quite useful to keep the conversation alive?
Yes, more and more now people are using technology, which is a really good thing. And I've mentioned here this Skype, this Messenger, FaceTime, you can emails, you can text prompts. So you can, for instance, remind a student that they've got a one-to-one review coming, don't forget to do your prep, you know, you can do that a week before and then another reminder the day before. So these things can help. And they're less time consuming than arranging a meeting and the concerns around all of that and accommodation, which is another issue. So yes, technology is playing an increasing part, and I think you can also through certain, I think ProMonitor and systems like ProMonitor, you can email learners with reminders and they can comment within that system and you can give feedback. So it's about encouraging the use of that to keep that conversation alive. It's not just a case of I've had a one-to-one review, job done until the next one, you know, the following term. We have to be more proactive than that.
And Emilu, thanks very much for your comment, because you're highlighting actually something about that in your college there is a system that students can use to view and update their own targets, but they don't always access it without being prompted. And I think actually, Sally, I saw a very good example at Bolton College last week. They use a digital assistant called ADA, A-D-A, And if you go and Google it, ADA, Digital Assistant, you'll get some more information, which I think is that system which automatically prompts them, just in case they forget that, you know, it says like, you've got a meeting with your tutor, or have you done the bit of work you were these meetings. So I think that's it's really good. Thanks for that, Emily. Thanks for that reminder.
That's great. Yes, wonderful. That's yeah, sounds like a good thing. I've not seen it myself, but I will take a look. Thanks for that. Okay, so next slide, please. So moving forward, these are questions for you, because I don't really want this to sit. And I think as well as these questions, which is about what you're going to do, I'd also like to know what we can do as a sector to improve this. I'd like to move this forward. It's nice to have this conversation with you, but I think we need to take action and to actually do something that I don't know, re-energizes this whole target setting process. So your feedback on that would be greatly appreciated. Is there anybody that's going to go back and change the world?
They would certainly follow up on some of the things you've already suggested, and certainly we've had 1 or 2 people wanted me to. I think Marek will send out details of AD. Obviously you've seen others as well, but I think it's absolutely incumbent on all of us to, as you said, go beyond SMART now. I think those days are over. Expect we'll activate, you've activated that discussion today.
Fabulous, fabulous. Can we move on to the next slide? Just a couple of events that the FETN are running, and I'll be doing this target setting thing as part of that conversation on the 30th of June. If anybody wants to book for that, it's on Eventbrite if you want to take a look at those 2 days. That's just for information. So yeah, I'm hoping to have more conversation about this and group tutorials in general. So next slide, please, Marek.
And if fact, Amy's just come in with a comment. Could students be retaught how to set targets effectively in group tutorials?
Absolutely, and I mean this is one of the things when I'm doing sort of tutorial audits and working with colleges to improve the one-to-ones. That is one of the things that I say to them is, do you actually teach your students how to do target setting? What a one-to-one review is about. You know, as part of induction, all this should be covered so that they're very clear on the process, that they understand what it is, because quite often it's just a 2-minute conversation about, well, you'll get a one-to-one review, and if you need any help, that's the place to get it. But it's a lot more than that. It's about learning and development, and we need to encourage that change of ethos, because I think another issue that we have when we explain it in that way is that we get a lot of more able students say, I don't need help, I don't need to go. But they do, because they need stretch and challenge. There's always something that we can be doing better. So I think it's really important to encourage that and to have that conversation and to teach people how to do target setting effectively. But in order to do that, we need our tutors to be skilled, and I don't think we're there yet. You know, there's a good way to go. So I think it's about upskilling staff and informing students, and the same activities that I do in staff training you can do with your students. So you know, everybody then understands it in the same way, and that's important, that everybody's talking about it in the same way. So if you've got any questions or comments after this webinar that pop into your head in the small wee hours, then my email address there, if you want to get in touch, please do. Like I say, I do want to start to get some momentum behind all of this, and to start and just re-energize this whole target setting thing, rethink it, and share it so that it becomes purposeful again. I think if I best get off my soapbox now, and it's over to you if there are any final questions.
That's great. Thanks very much then, Sally. And I think for everyone that's been listening in today, and those obviously that will listen to the recording, when you get copies of the slides, don't worry, you won't have all of this interference on the slides. This has only affected those of us who have been listening in live. I think the key thing is what Sally was saying and how it related to what you'll see when you get the recording. Thanks very much, Sally, for that, and thanks very much for the questions. We just had one clarification. I think one of you wanted to know what the thing at Bolton was. It's ADA, ADA, as opposed to AGA or anything else it sounded like. So it's ADA. So if you just do ADA and then digital assistant, you'll find that Bolton comes up. And I think key thing again is Sally's given you her email, a telephone to contact her. I think different models of target setting other than SMART. Well, maybe that's what we need to create between us, as well as obviously use all the other different ways in which the network can support you, which is obviously on that list of things there. And I think it's important that you take advantage of this opportunity. Are there any more questions, Marek, that you can see for Sally, or comments?
Yeah, any further questions or comments? Anything that we've missed as well? Because I've been working away in the background just to try and make sure that technically everything was running quite smoothly. So yeah, if I have missed a question, please pop it through to us now as a reminder, and we'll make sure we cover it off now before we finish. I think we have got another one there that's just come through. I'm just going to have a quick look there. Let me have a look.
It's about funding from Paul, I think. One of the issues that this is certainly raised, isn't it?
That's it, from Paul, and I think there's a couple from Nikki as well. I'm just going to poke them through. Have you got those?
Well, Nikki's asked, well, Paul's asked, first of all, where's the funding to support some of this? And clearly, I mean, I can comment on that, Sally, because part of the 16 to 19 study program, you've got hours allocated as part of the 600 hours the students have got, which are obviously funded by the ESFA, to pay for tutorial, and in particular to pay for one-to-one target setting, which I know some of you have built in. So I think that might be an issue for you to discuss internally, since actually there's already the funding there. Less so for adults, and that's obviously is an issue, Paul, you've raised. Nick is asking, is it possible to have a to share in the sector, for example, looking at things other than SMART? And that's come from Nikki Almond.
Okay, Beach, could you just repeat that, Beach, because it just cut out for just a little bit. Just repeat what Nikki requested there.
Yeah, Nikki Almond was asking, is it possible to have a working party to create further resources to share in the sector, for example, looking at something other than SMART?
Oh, super.
Hi, Nikki. Lovely question. Yes, we can certainly do that. If anybody's interested in kind of getting a working party together, if you want to email me on info@fetn.org.uk, then I'll get in touch with everybody and we'll see if we can arrange it.
Yeah, I'll be making sure you all get a copy of these slides as well. So Sally's contact details are on there. And I would certainly recommend getting in contact with her. And certainly, I think this is a super idea as well. Thanks for that, Nikki.
I think that's it then. That's great. Thank you, Marek. Thank you very much, Sally.
Yeah.
You're very welcome. Been a pleasure.